The speculation grew because Graham had recently been the target of hostile rhetoric. Reports noted that threats mentioning Graham, Trump, and other American officials had appeared during events in Iran. Russian commentators had also harshly criticized him in the past. Those details fueled online suspicions, leading some people to believe his death could not have been natural. Yet investigators offered a very different picture. Several law enforcement officials told CNN there was no indication that Graham's death involved foul play. Authorities described the investigation as a standard review conducted whenever someone dies unexpectedly at home. The FBI confirmed it was assisting local authorities, but officials emphasized that this was routine cooperation rather than evidence of a criminal investigation. Most importantly, emergency responders had been treating cardiac arrest, not symptoms pointing to poisoning or another mysterious cause. There was also another fact many people overlooked. Heart disease ran through Graham's family. His father died from a heart attack at the age of 69. That family history made a cardiac emergency a sadly plausible explanation. While many people searched for complicated answers, the simplest possibility remained the strongest one supported by the available information. But Graham's family history also revealed something deeply personal that many Americans never knew. Despite decades in public life, Lindsey Graham never married and never had children. For years, people speculated about why. The real answer traced back to heartbreaking events early in his adulthood. When he was just 21 years old, his mother died from cancer. Only about 15 months later, his father died from heart disease, leaving Graham responsible for his younger sister while the family struggled to keep their small business alive. Instead of walking away, he made a life-changing decision. Graham became his sister's guardian and later formally adopted her so she could receive his military benefits. While most people his age were building their own futures, he focused on keeping his family together. His sister later described him as being not only a brother, but also a father and a mother. Those responsibilities shaped the rest of his life in ways the public rarely saw. Suddenly, many things about him began to make more sense. When asked over the years why he had never married, Graham usually answered with humor. He joked that he never found the right woman, and that the right woman was smart enough not to wait for someone constantly working in Washington. Behind that lighthearted response was a lifetime spent putting family responsibilities ahead of his own personal life. Much of the love and devotion he might have given elsewhere had already been dedicated to raising his sister through unimaginable hardship. That personal history gives new meaning to the tributes that poured in after his death. When President Trump said Graham felt like family, those words carried extra weight. Graham had built lasting friendships through loyalty, persistence, and personal sacrifice. Even many political opponents described him as someone they genuinely respected. But perhaps the most surprising relationship of all was the one he developed with Donald Trump. Considering where it began, few people ever expected it. Back in 2015, Graham harshly criticized Trump, calling him dangerous and warning that his leadership would damage the Republican Party. After the events of January 6, 2021, Graham publicly declared he had reached his limit with Trump. Looking back at those moments, it seemed impossible that the two men would ever become close friends. Yet politics often takes unexpected turns. Over time, Graham became one of Trump's closest allies. He defended the former president during some of his most difficult political moments. They golfed together, spoke frequently by phone, and Graham often joked that although Trump was an excellent golfing partner, he had never managed to beat him. He even described himself as Trump's North Star on foreign policy. Their relationship evolved from fierce disagreement into genuine friendship, making that final phone call all the more meaningful. Respect for Graham extended far beyond Republican circles. Democratic senators who had debated him for years praised both his honesty and his willingness to work across party lines. Political opponents described him as a tough negotiator, but also a loyal friend. In a city known for deep divisions, Graham managed to earn admiration from people who rarely agreed with him. That ability may be one of the reasons his death resonated so widely. Yet there was still one final chapter he never got to finish. At the time of his death, Graham was focused on passing a major sanctions package targeting countries supporting Russia's war effort. After more than a year of work, he believed the White House had finally agreed to support the legislation. He truly thought victory was within reach. Tragically, he never lived to see the bill come to a vote. Now many of his colleagues hope to pass that legislation as part of his legacy. Supporters from both political parties have suggested that approving the bill would honor the work Graham devoted so much of his final year to completing. If it eventually becomes law, it may stand as the last major achievement of a career that lasted more than 2 decades in the United States Senate. His passing also leaves a significant political vacancy. Graham had recently won his party's primary and was preparing to seek another full Senate term. After serving South Carolina for more than 20 years, he became only the third person to hold that Senate seat in nearly 7 decades. State leaders described his death as the loss of a truly unique public servant whose influence would not easily be replaced. In the end, perhaps the hardest truth is also the simplest. A man who spent decades shaping national debates, traveling the world, and building unlikely friendships appeared healthy, spoke with the president about future plans, returned home after a long journey, and within hours was gone. Whether history remembers him for his foreign policy, his political alliances, or his deeply personal sacrifices, one thing is certain. Those who knew him best are still trying to understand how a day filled with hope could end with sirens outside his home and a final phone call that no one realized would be the last. The President of the United States struggled to keep his composure on a Sunday morning, and this time it had almost nothing to do with politics. Just hours earlier, he had spoken with Senator Lindsey Graham. Now he found himself replaying every word of that conversation, wondering if there had been any sign that something was wrong. The man who rarely lets the public see his emotions sounded deeply shaken, and what he shared about that final phone call left many people stunned. But what made that conversation so unforgettable? During several television interviews that morning, President Donald Trump kept returning to the same memory. On Saturday evening, around 7 o'clock, he had spoken with Graham shortly after the senator landed from a long overseas trip. Graham sounded like he always did. He was focused, energetic, and already talking about the legislation he hoped to move forward. They discussed the Save America Act, and Trump told him they would get done together. Then they ended the call, believing it was just another conversation between longtime political allies. Neither of them had any reason to think it would be their last. But what happened only a short time later changed everything. As Trump spoke publicly, one painful thought kept running through his mind. He realized that their phone call may have taken place only minutes, or perhaps an hour, before Graham suddenly collapsed. Looking into the cameras, he admitted that it could have been their final conversation. He described the loss as devastating and said Graham had become like family to him. For someone known for projecting confidence, the emotion in his voice was impossible to ignore. Yet there was one small detail that haunted him more than anything else. Why couldn't he stop thinking about it? Trump said Graham had sounded tired. Not sick. Not distressed, just tired after a long journey. Other than that, he seemed completely normal. That ordinary detail became the hardest part to accept because it reminded everyone how quickly life can change. Trump even tried to comfort himself, saying perhaps passing suddenly is not the worst way for someone to go. It sounded like a man trying to understand an unimaginable loss while speaking to the entire country. Then, in the early hours of Sunday morning, everything became real. Around 1 o'clock that morning, Trump received a message from someone in Graham's office. In a single moment, a friendship that had survived years of political disagreements, public criticism, and changing alliances came to an end. To understand why the president sounded so deeply affected, you have to look at where Lindsey Graham had been only 1 day earlier. The contrast is almost impossible to believe. Less than 24 hours before his death, Graham appeared full of energy while visiting Kiev, Ukraine. It was his 10th visit since Russia's full-scale invasion began, and Ukrainian leaders welcomed him warmly. President Volodymyr Zelensky greeted him personally, and Graham toured a factory producing military drones. Holding one of the aircraft designed to intercept enemy drones, he spoke enthusiastically about the lessons Ukraine had learned during the war. He argued that America should work closely with Ukraine because its engineers had developed remarkable technology under extraordinary pressure. But the biggest announcement of the trip was still ahead. Standing before rows of destroyed Russian military vehicles, Graham told reporters that he had just reached an agreement with the White House on a major sanctions bill targeting Russia. He confidently declared that the legislation would become law and said he had never felt more optimistic about finding a path toward ending the war. He believed the new sanctions would place enormous pressure on Moscow and eventually force meaningful negotiations. It was one of the most hopeful moments of his recent career. Sadly, no one there knew they were witnessing his final public appearance. Graham wasn't slowing down. He wasn't preparing for retirement or stepping away from public life. He had just achieved a breakthrough he had spent more than a year pursuing. Surrounded by colleagues who admired him, he was already planning his next moves. Then he boarded a plane, flew back to Washington, landed, spoke with President Trump, and returned home. Like everyone around him, he believed another busy week lay ahead. Instead, an unseen countdown had already begun. And then came the emergency call. At around 8:30 Saturday evening, emergency crews were dispatched to Graham's Capitol Hill home after reports that someone inside was suffering from chest pains. Within minutes, the situation became far more serious. According to emergency communications, what began as chest pain quickly turned into cardiac arrest. First responders immediately began life-saving efforts, performing CPR in a desperate attempt to restore his heartbeat. It was a race against time, but would it be enough? A nearby resident watched emergency vehicles fill the street and quietly recorded the scene from her window. Around 9:30, a man was wheeled from a home on a stretcher before being loaded into an ambulance and rushed to George Washington University Hospital. Less than 2 days earlier, Graham had been smiling in the middle of a war zone. Now doctors were fighting to save his life. Somewhere inside that hospital, despite every effort, the battle came to an end. In the early hours of Sunday morning, Graham's office released a brief statement announcing that the senator had died following a sudden illness. The statement asked for prayers and privacy, but offered few additional details. There was no lengthy explanation, and no official cause of death announced at that time. The silence surrounding those first announcements created countless unanswered questions. And when there are unanswered questions surrounding the sudden death of a well-known public figure, speculation often spreads faster than facts. Within hours, social media was flooded with theories. Some online commentators wondered whether Graham had been poisoned because of his outspoken support for Ukraine and his strong criticism of Russia. Activist Laura Loomer publicly called for a full investigation and a toxicology report. The timing certainly appeared unusual to many observers. Graham had just returned from Ukraine after promoting tougher sanctions against Russia. Could there really be more to the story?